So let's begin. I think we were in the middle of discussing the psukim that are the basis for the mitzvah of Yibum. So again, I'm just going to bring us back to where we were for a moment, and then we will move forward. So let me just get my marmakomos, see if I can find them. So the Masechet Yevamos, this is how we began. Masechet Yevamos on the base Omid Aleph really begins in a very, I think, unusual fashion. Instead of the Mishnah in the beginning of the Masechta describing, the primary case, which would be a description of a marriage where the husband dies without leaving any children, and therefore the obligation of the brothers to be miyabim, to marry the sister-in-law. That would have been the normal, expected beginning of the Masechta. We have something very similar in Masechet Kiddushin, where the Mishnah, describes the process of getting married. Ha'isha niknes begimel derachim, and in the end of that Mishnah, it actually says it relates to Yibum, and it says that Hayibama niknes, b'Yibum, the kones atzma b'misas ha'yavam u'b'chalitza. So the point is that it's not so difficult to imagine, let's say, a more conventional beginning that would describe the case and the classic case and would kind of lay out, the procedures for Yibum. For example, we'll discuss very extensively. There's a big machlokes already among the Tanaim in the Mishnah, whether Yibum is preferable or Chalitza is preferable. That would have been a good place to start. Instead, the Mishnah starts by telling us that, I'll just going to read the language again, just very quickly. But the first Mishnah tells us that there are 15 wives whose presence is candidates for Yibum. Chameshas Reinashin potros tzarosayim, the tzaros tzarosayim, mina chalitzo, mina Yibum ad sofa olam, the Elohein, bito, bas bino, bas ishto, bas bina, bas bita, chamoso, em chamoso, and so on. So basically, the Mishnah begins by telling us not a description of the circumstances or the way in which Yibum and Chalitza are implemented, but it tells us it kind of starts in the middle of the story, and it starts with an exception rather than with the rule. It starts by telling us that if any of the following relationships are in the candidate pool of Yibum, then there's no Yibum at all. There's no need for Yibum, there's no need for Chalitza, etc. So, for example, if you have two brothers, let's say Ruvain and Shimon, and Ruvain marries Shimon's daughter, which is halachically permissible. It doesn't happen very often in our time, but a man is allowed to marry his brother's daughter, meaning his niece. So let's say Ruvain married Shimon's daughter, his niece, and he had a second wife as well in biblical times when you could be married to more than one woman. So he was married to, let's say, Sarah, the daughter of Shimon, and Rachel, a second wife. So what the Mishnah is telling us is that if Ruvain dies and he doesn't leave any children, and therefore his brother encounters or faces a Yibum situation, then under those conditions, he now has two candidates for Yibum. One candidate is Sarah, his own daughter, and the other one is this other girl, Rachel, who is not related to him previously in any other way. Now, obviously, he doesn't have the option of being miyabim his daughter, because his daughter is off limits to him in any kind of relationship. But the chiddush of the Mishnah is to teach you that not only is the daughter excluded from Yibum and Chalitza, but also the other wife, the co-wife, the rival wife, meaning what we're calling Rachel here, she's also excluded from Yibam and Chalitza. That's called the din of Ptur Erva and Saros. And what we are trying to ask, and we're not going to answer it today either, but that's we're getting closer to answering it, is why would Rabbi, the editor of the Mishnah, why would he want to begin in the middle of the story with a very complicated exception to where there's no Yibam, instead of beginning, at the beginning with a description of a typical classical case of Yibam. A classic case of Yibam is you have Reuven and Shimon, their brothers. Reuven has, let's say, he's married to 3 different women. He dies prematurely. Now Shimon is faced with, these 3 women and has an obligation of Yibum with one of them. That's a typical case of Yibum. He has to decide, is he going to do Yibum with one of these women and continue, a life with her? Or is he going to do Chalitza and walk away, but also end or terminate the Zika, in the process? So that's a classic case of Yibum. Why wouldn't the Mishnah want to begin with that? So I can't really explain why it wouldn't want to begin with the classical case, but I am going to, as we go forward, try to explain what I think it is about this complicated case of confronting not only an erva as one of the candidates, but that's spilling over into disqualifying, the others as well. That's something I'm going to try to explain. So that's issue number 1 that we raised. I'm just catching us up. Issue number 2 is a parallel issue, something that the Tosas Yeshanim on the side of the Gemara asks right in the beginning of the Masechta. Tosas Yeshanim says, commenting on the words of the Mishnah, so he says, Yesh Makshim, some people ask, Amai Matchil Seder Nashim Bivamos, Tadchule Purnus Alom Metchalina, Va'adarabba, Hayalona Lahatchil Kidushin Uksuvos Begitin Vyachakach Yivamos. So the question that he asks, and this is really a question that the Rambam asks in his commentary on the Mishnah. The Rambam wrote a massive introduction to his commentary on the Mishnah, and he wrote a commentary, not so extensive, but on all of Mishnayos. It's printed usually in the back of the regular Gemaras. Anyway, so in his analysis in the introduction to all Mishnayos, one of the things that the Rambam, sets out as a task is to explain the order of the Mishnayos. He obviously felt that it wasn't random, and that the author of the Mishnah definitely had something in mind when he organized it in this fashion. So the Rambam asked the same question, namely, if you had to choose the order in Seder Nashim, would you begin with Yavamos, the most rare of cases and the most rule-breaking of cases? Or wouldn't you, prefer to begin with something like Kiddushin, and then, speak about Nisuin and Ksuva, start with Masechet Kiddushin, then go to Ksuvos, then go to Gittin, or something like that. But in the organizational model of the Meiri, for example, it really is true. Yevamos is not the first Masechta in Seder Nashim, but in the model of the Rambam and the Balei Tosas, it was. So they were troubled. Like, why would the order of Nashim be organized with such preference or priority to Masechet Yevamos? So again, this is a question. They give different answers. I'm not going to go through all the answers right now. Some of them are very interesting. The bigger point that I'm trying to make is, I can tell you my opinion, is that, and this goes to point number 3 in our recap, and that is that the Torah in Parshas Kitetse addresses the mitzvah of Yibum v'chalitza. In Parshas Kitetse, it also addresses the mitzvah of Gittin and Kiddushin. So, but it's interesting that the Torah does not put these two groups of laws together, meaning there are numerous other halachos that separate between the Torah's presentation in Perek Chav Beis of Devarim, of Gittin v'Kiddushin and Matzah Grushaso, something we spoke about a lot last year, and Yibum and Chalitza, which is in the 25th chapter of Devarim. So obviously with the Torah, in a broad way is telling us is that Yibum and Chalitza represent a rare case and an exception to certain rules. And it is an exception to certain rules. The most obvious of which is that normally a sister-in-law is prohibited. She cannot be, a wife, to a brother-in-law, even if there's a divorce and even if there's a death. Eshes Ach, the wife of a brother, is one of the arayos, is one of the forbidden or illicit relationships that the Torah defines in Parshas Achrimos and in Kedoshim. But Yibum, of course, is exactly that. Yibum is the circumstance where the brother left no children, and Eshes Ach has a zika, means she is tied. Her fate, her future is tied to the decision of the brother-in-law of the Yavam, and then he goes ahead. He does either Yibum or Chalitza. So of course, that is the biggest exception of them all. But there are other exceptions too. The very category of Zika, as we've noted, the Torah calls, the Yavama, the wife or the wives, Eshes Hames. And again, that in itself is a problem. What do you mean Eshes Hames? Typically, like the Mishnah says in Kiddushin, when a person dies, the marriage is over. So there's no Eshes Hames, is there? I mean, it refers to a past relationship, not a present legal condition. But in Yibum, the Zika is about, her continuing status in some respect as Eshes Hames.
Isn't there a larger overarching issue? You said last week, that the closeness of the Yibum is supposed to bring out a certain closeness in the relationship that is the fundamental of, so to speak, of every marriage, is that the relationship is to the family as well. But there's a counterbalancing, a very strong counterbalancing thing in Yadus. In fact, in Yom Kippur, we learn at Mincha time to show that the closeness of family also presents a great concern that we have to be careful about, because all the Erevos are, in fact, the closest relatives.
Right.
So there has to be that contradicting concept of, in a way, very great closeness of sorts, but a physical distancing.
No, 100%. That's exactly what I'm trying to get at. And again, that's why if it wasn't for Lahakim La'achiv Shem, be Israel, V'lo Yimaches Shemo, if this weren't a service to the brother, then of course it would be a severe prohibition. So one idea of hutra, what we call hutra, as opposed to dechuya, meaning that the prohibition of Isra Eshes Ach was never said under these conditions, is based exactly on this idea, and that is that we're dealing with two, not contradictory, but two opposite aspects. Maybe. Right. So as long as there is no good reason, it's a betrayal of a brother, to engage in any kind of relationship with his former wife, whether it's grusha or mesa. Right. It's only unseemly and a violation of everybody's tznius and privacy and sensibility. But that's the point. When it's a way of securing his future, meaning the mace, so that's not a betrayal. On the contrary, ignoring the possibility of doing something for his legacy is the betrayal. So you're right. It's a very fine line. By the way, that I think I said it last week also, but we'll discuss it much more thoroughly. But Abba Shaul, on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis, has a very remarkable shita. He says that Yibum is only preferable if you can pull it off perfectly, meaning if you can do it lishma, l'shem lahakim la'akiv shem b'Yisrael. But if you can't, if you have like mixed feelings, meaning, l'shem yofi, l'shem, momon, whatever it is, if you, are like drawn to other aspects of this prospect or possibility, according to Abba Shaul, that totally, poisons the well. And then you're back to, like you said before, the closeness being a problem, not the closeness being, a license. So this is a very, you're right. I mean, you're walking a very, very, with Abba Shaul, you really see it, but even without it.
La composition de l'ONU, je crois qu'il y a 193 États, il y a une majorité de dictatures très large.
Du droit,
voilà.
Pas son public.
Oui, mais,
on reprend notre discussion.
Voilà. Mais tous les politiciens du monde parlent à leur public et ils parlent aussi à son public qui est majoritairement plutôt sur la ligne du sud global et des régimes autoritaires que sur la ligne occidentale.
Et pour des raisons ou bien religieuses, parce que c'est les pays musulmans, ou bien idéologiques, parce que Israël est un pays colonisateur. C'est facile à comprendre pour les opinions publiques. De ce fait, il y a une majorité à l'ONU qui est contre Israël. Alors après ça, pour l'emploi de l'étoile jaune, moi j'ai tendance à dire que des symboles si forts, il faut les utiliser comme dernière mesure, voyez-vous. Et là, il y a ce côté presque un peu en scène, parce que c'est trop grave pour ça, mais quand même, il sort tout ça, il le met, les deux collaborateurs qui sont derrière lui, entre guillemets, ça banalise, à mon avis, cette image, et en ça, c'est contre-productif, même si sur le fond, ça ne me choque pas.
Renaud, moi, je trouve le geste totalement inapproprié, banalisation.
Yeah, if we could all mute, I think that would be better. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so okay, so this is where we were, and then we examined the psukim. That's what we're in the middle of, and the psukim tell us that ki yeshvu achim yachtav, and it's about brotherhood. And I believe last week we learned the Gemara in Daf Chav Daled Amud Aleph, the second pasuk, which says, "V'hoya b'chor asher teled yakum al shem achiv ameis v'lo yimacheh shemo miYisrael," where the Gemara says that. Gemara's trouble. How come we call the brother who does the ibum? Why do we call him a bechor if he's not really a bechor? Right. So again, in both of these cases, what I wanted to suggest is that what we're trying to do here is we are trying to expand the family obligation vis-a-vis the deceased brother, and that's why the Torah uses the expression bechor, because even though it isn't really a bechor, it highlights the special obligation and stature that the Yavam has in the family, because he's basically discharging this wider obligation. Okay, so that's where we are. So now I want to examine the position of the Ramban in light of this. So let's, if we have the Marmakovas in front of us, which I hope we do, let's look at the Ramban in Bereshis. Let's first look at the Psukim in Bereshis, and then we'll look at the Ramban in Bereshis. So in Parshas Vayeshev, one second, let me find the Psukim. Yeah. So in Parshas Vayeshev, Parak Lamed Ches in Bereshis, and my Marmakomos, this is on page 3. Does everybody have that? Page 3? I'm not hearing from anybody. Page 3 in the Marmakomos?
Got to get to it. 1 second.
It looks like you're doing it on your phone. Okay, at least I can see you, so I'm glad for that.
It's not cooperating, my phone. 1 second.
Since you're the only person I'm hearing and seeing, we're going to go by your readiness.
Won't open the page for me for some reason.
No, it's all right. It's on page 3, the bottom of page 3.
Ah, okay, good. Good to hear your voice as well.
Thank you.
So on page 3, we have the psukim from Bereshis Parak Lamed Ches, and the background, of course, is, I think, very important. This is in the middle of the Yosef story. This is where Yehuda, it's really, I'm not sure how much of this is, good drush or pshat, but I think it's the pshat. Maybe Dr. Eichler will tell us. But in Parak Lamed Ches Pasuk Aleph, this little part, this chapter of Yehuda and Tamar and Er and Onan and Shelah and so on is introduced by the phrase Vayered Yehuda.
After Yehuda failed in his obligation as the leader of the brothers to.
So this is in the aftermath of the selling of Yosef, and the terrible implications of that, and the cruel, the brothers, witnessed the cruelty that they visited, upon Yaakov Avinu, and Yehuda was like a natural leader of the brothers, as we know, even much more so than Ruvain, in the whole Yosef story, and even before. Ruvain is the oldest, but Ruvain, seems to be deficient.
Ruvain tried.
What's that?
Ruvain tried.
Ruvain tries, but his efforts reflect some deficiencies in his
what Yaakov took him to task for.
So Yehuda also tries, but Yehuda's much more decisive. Yehuda speaks about Yosef as a brother, but he also says Mabetza, like, what are we gaining from this? And even if that's just to sell to the brothers, it's almost like Reuven's effort is just unsatisfactory in every way. Yehuda, there are elements of his approach, that have potential, and therefore Chazal are very disappointed with the fact that he, displaying, some sensitivity here, doesn't follow through and take a really decisive stand. And instead of saying Mabetza, like, what do we gain out of this kind of killing him? Let's sell him. If he'd been forceful,
he's getting held to a higher standard because he had the respect of the brothers. He could have made an impact.
He has the respect of the brothers, and he has hit the right note in that he's talking about Yosef as a brother, and how could we do this to our brother? Just that he then turns it in a very pragmatic way. So in a way, we're more impressed and more disappointed at the same time with Yehuda. Because and remember, if you look early at the Parsha, the whole Yosef story is, of course, about brothers. And when Yosef goes looking for his brothers, it's Esachai and Anochim Avakesh.
I mean, it's an issue of potential on both ends. I mean, Yehuda had a potential to do what he should have done. He didn't do it. And so he let the potential go. So when you get to Yibum, it's about the potential also, the brother.
We'll get to that. So, but my bigger point is that of all the brothers, Yehuda displays, on the one hand, the greatest potential and sensitivity, to what's really going on, which is, this effort of rapprochement between brothers and the extra also flexibility that brothers need to give each other. But at the same time, he falls short. So I think it's, the pshat is fine, but I think it's more, more than that when the Torah introduces the Parsha of Yibum by saying, Vayered Yehuda mitoch echav. I think it's like saying, in the aftermath, seeing that he didn't do enough, even though he was on the right track, seeing, what he had caused in terms of the pain that he inflicted on his father, like it became clear to him that he had, let down, the concept of brotherhood. So it's Vayered mitoch echav. And the next thing we know, we're right in the middle of a Yibum Parsha, which in Parshas Kitetze, right, is introduced by Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachtav, and which is all about, a special obligation owed to brothers. So I don't think any of that is coincidence. I think that's, what this is all about, Mitzchila V'Yad. And by the way, if you continue to chart the psukim, what's that?
Are we taking the approach that Yehuda, by seeing what his sons did, not to do the right thing in protecting the memory of their brother, it brings home to him how he failed in his relationship with Yosef?
Yeah, what I'm saying, I don't know which comes first, the chicken or the egg, or it's all, whatever. But what I am saying is Vayered mitoch echav, and this background leading to the first, formal case of Yibum, and everything that goes into it is not a coincidence.
Coincidental.
Right. And by the way, the language of, the Torah's, continuous effort and emphasis, on the word echav, achiv, achav, achiv, in the whole continuation of the story too. Even when he meets them, and they don't know who he is, and then later when he does reveal himself, and then later again in Parshas Vayechi,
by the way, when brothers finally realize and they say, Aval Hashem manachnu.
Hashem manachnu b'schanu, they say achinu. Yeah, exactly. But that's part of my, I don't want to go through all of it now because it'll take too long. But I have a chapter and verse, all the achinus here. But I do. And by the way, that the Ramban says that Hashem manachnu, b'schanu elenu v'lo shamanu, meaning it doesn't matter what we think he did. In the end of the day, how could we have been insensitive to the cries of a brother?
Actually, halakhically, they had, so to speak, technically a leg to stand on. That wasn't the crime. The crime was the fact that there's no. How could you do this to your brother under any circumstance?
And whether or not they really had.
Again, I said a leg to stand on. It didn't say.
Right. I mean, this famous view of the Sforno that became very popular, that the brothers, considered Yosef to be like a rodef. But I
said a leg. I didn't say four.
Right. But for them to think that and not to give him the benefit of the doubt, or even if they did think it, not to let brotherly sentiment override that, which is what they're saying when they say Hashem manachnu. Like, how could we just have a deaf ear to his cries? He's our brother, and So anyway, I think the whole parsha is very. Mitchila v'ad sof is about. Anyways, so it's Vayikach Yehuda Isha le'er b'choro ushma Tamar. Just to read these psukim for a moment. Yehuda marries off his Bechor, which is interesting also because, again, Bechor, factually he's a Bechor. But last week we read the Gemara Daf Chav Dalet Amud Aleph, and the idea that, again, the Yavam is called a Bechor, even if he isn't a Bechor.
Why does it matter for the information in this parsha that he was a Bechor? It wouldn't change anything.
Right. It doesn't really. I mean, legally it doesn't.
Right.
Maybe the idea, though, is, it kind of accentuates even more the sense of family responsibility, but meaning halachically, there's no difference. But by calling him a Bechor, I think it just, and he was a Bechor, and a Bechor has an outsized role in the family responsibility. So the responsibility to him was also greater, maybe not in a way that is material halachically, because either way there's a responsibility, but it made it worse, in other words. That's what I think. Anyways, Vahi Bechor Yehuda Rabbi Hashem, right? Vayimiseu Hashem. Chazal say that he didn't, he was Rabbi Hashem in the way that he, conducted himself in his marriage, because he, this is, at least one very popular view in Chazal, he didn't want to have children. He wanted to have a purely hedonistic, casual relationship, bilateral relationship, and he didn't want, the physical, I guess, attributes, of his wife, to change, and therefore, he behaved, in a way that halachically was problematic, and may not even have been, complete marriage, or that's we'll get to that the Balitosis and Chizkuni's view. But the point is, there are two things going on here. But the point is that part of this story is like, what does it mean to be married and to to produce a family? Like, to what extent is having children and a legacy and responsibility, and building something bigger, is that crucial to
the fact that he didn't want to have a family, the yibum obligation of the brother to do what he wasn't willing and even interested in doing.
That's a great point. That's a great point. But anyway, the Torah calls him Rab B'einei Hashem, for conducting his marriage according to this very dominant view in Chazal, in a way that wouldn't produce a family, and that itself is very significant. But you're right, and when he's like, to use the Shakespearean phrase, he was a little bit hoisted on his own petard, because
but I think the Torah is using this extreme position to say that even though he himself did something foolish, and he's going to be hurt so badly still by that act, and we must do something to rectify it.
Right, 100%. Vayomer Hashem, Vayomer Yehuda, sorry, Leonin, that's the brother. Bo el Eshes Achicha. Here you have double Achicha in this pasuk. You should, you should be involved.
Could have saved the word by simply saying the name of the brother. And Torah usually
but Eshes Achicha, because it's a legal category and it's a way of accentuating this. V'yabemosa, and again, V'hakem Zera L'Achicha, twice in one pasuk. So this, of course, the first explicit reference to Yibum in the Torah. And it's also called Hakem Zera L'Achicha. So then the Torah says, Vayeda Onan, Ki lo lo, and that's an interesting phrase anyway, right? Linguistically. Ki lo lo, meaning like what's low and what's low, but it's intentional that he would not have Ki lo lo yeh hazer, though the zera wouldn't belong to him. What does that mean? We'll discuss it. If he indeed, completes this yibum with his sister-in-law, he too, this is even more explicit, had no intention of conducting himself in a way that would produce a potential, that even potentially would produce an heir. Instead, he was going to engage in the kind of conduct probably that his brother had previously, and again because he didn't want to produce a family and a legacy for his brother. So then the Torah says, "Vayera b'nei Hashem asher asa vayomas gamoso." Then you have Vayomer Yehuda leTamar kalaso. He says to his daughter-in-law, right, because he feels obligated, he feels a responsibility to her. Shvi almana beis avich adigdal shela b'ni ki amar pen yamus gam hu ke'achav vatelech Tamar vateshev beis avia.
He was treating her as a katlanis.
Then comes what's that?
He was treating her as a katlanis, as a.
So that's what one of the views in the Chazal is, that he was treating her. The two husbands died. He wasn't in such a hurry to give her.
He didn't know why they died, dude.
It's hard. It's impossible to know. It's hard to know.
And how would it help avoid this by waiting till Shayla grows up? Unless that was just a
right. So that if you look at the Ramban, maybe I don't know if we'll discuss that Ramban, even though it's here on the page. Right? Was he serious? Was he just like putting her off, etc. Anyways, what happens in the interim, I didn't put in here, not because I'm censoring it, but because it's not relevant to the Yibum part. But the short part of the story is, as we know, is that Yehuda, after a while goes by, so he encounters Tamar. She is covered up or dressed in a way that he doesn't know who she is. And, he himself, this is, problematic behavior. He wants to have a physical relationship with her, not knowing it's Tamar. And, he gives her his some of his belongings, and then all of a sudden, she shows up pregnant in the community. And, they're about to bring her, to execute her, for betraying. We'll get to that in a second.
So she wasn't for what she did.
And then finally, she says, she's such a tzaddikus that instead of, telling the whole story, because she doesn't want to embarrass Yehuda, her father-in-law, so she says, like, she just produces the materials that, would identify who, the father of her child is. And then the Torah says, Vayak, this is Pasuk Chava, Vayaker Yehuda. Yehuda recognizes, the ring and the whole bit. And he's very honest. So Vayomer Tzadka Mimeni, he was about to, relegate her, to this punishment. And instead he says, Tzadka Mimeni, right? She's more righteous than I am. Kialkain lo nesatia l'sheila b'ni. He said, it's my fault that I delayed, and she is innocent. V'lo yosaf od ledata. Now, v'lo yosaf od ledata is very interesting also. because lo yasaf od ledata has a double meaning. There are two views in the Gemara in Sota. One view is lo yasaf means lo hosif, meaning he did not continue to have a relationship with her, meaning he fathered her child and then he terminated the relationship. Lo yasaf means he lo hosif, he didn't continue. But the word yasaf can also mean the opposite. It can mean the lo yasaf means he didn't end the relationship. Oh. The relationship continued. Like we said, kol gadol v'lo yasaf. Sometimes yasaf or yosif means to continue, and sometimes it means to conclude or terminate, to end. So this is the
if we follow the more seemingly obvious first interpretation, we have cases where there are problematic yibums where the first bia is permitted and nothing after that.
Right. So we have that in Chai Belavin.
Is this a similar situation?
So we're going to discuss that. We will discuss that. So hold that thought because we'll discuss it. Okay. So now I want to read the Ramban's take on this whole parsha. Now remember, this is all Kodem Matan Torah, but the Ramban's view was that even though there are some differences between pre-Matan Torah and post-Matan Torah, fundamentally we're dealing with some very small exceptions with the same institution of Yibum. It's Yibum. Okay. So what does it mean via Beimosav? Yehuda said to Onan, right, via Beimosav, Akem Zera Lachicha. You should do Yibum, and you should uphold the seed of your brother, meaning you should produce a child that would be a legacy for your brother. So Rashi says, Haben Yikarei al Shem Ames. Even though Rashi in Parshas Kitetse, based on the Gemara Chavdala that we read last week, says that, Kriyas Shem doesn't really mean the name that you give. It's more like the Yerusha legacy. But in pre-Matan Torah, in this Yehuda Tamar or Onan Shelah story, here Rashi says, Haben Yikarei al Shem Ames. And the Ramban is very upset. So the Ramban says, MS. I'm on page 3, by the way, of the Marmakoma.
That's a very strong Lashon, Einza MS.
Einza MS, not true.
Wow.
Why? Ki b'mitzvahs haTorah, I'm reading this, I'm assuming people have access to it. It's on page 3, the bottom of the Marmakomos. The Einza MS, ki b'mitzvahs haTorah, Nemar, Gamkein Yakum al Shem Achiv Hames. He should be, standing, on the name of the brother, the deceased brother. V'lo yimachesh shemo b'Yisrael, and his name will not be, obliterated in Yisrael. Ve'ena yavam b'tzuva likor livno k'shem achiv hameis, and it's not true that there's an obligation to call the child that is produced by the yavam and the yavama, right, the mace's name. So if the mace was Bob, you don't have to call him Bob or Bob Jr. or anything like that. The Haraya, Boaz. Remember, there's a story in Rus, the story in Rus. So Machlon and Chilion, right? Machlon was married to Rus, and now Boaz in the end is going to be the Goel of Rus. So what? And they have a child. What's the name of the child? Anybody? Oved, right?
This is not a real Yibum.
Okay, well, we'll get to that. But the language used in Rus is also the language of Lo Yikares Shemo Yisrael. So look at the Ramban says, the Omar Beboaz, V'gamas Ruva Rusa Moabia, Esha Smachlon, Konisi Lilisha, Lahakim Shema Meis al Nachalaso, even if it isn't a full Yibum, but the language of Lahakim Shema Meis, V'lo Yikares Shema Meis, Me'im Echav Umishar Mekomo. So you want to know what that means. Vatikranosa Oved, V'lo Machlon. They didn't call him Machlon. So, and not only that, that's the Gemara Chav Daled Amud Aleph and Yevamos that we read last week, which is that it doesn't mean literally to call him a name. So why does Rashi think it's calling the name? So the Mizrahi, Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, wrote a famous Perush on Rashi in the 16th century. So he says Rashi distinguishes between pre-Matan Torah and post-Matan Torah. Post-Matan Torah, there's no obligation to name the child after the deceased, but pre-Matan Torah, there was. Interesting. Anyways, the Ramban doesn't like it. Number one, it's against Rus. Number two, it's against the halacha, right, as we encounter it in Parshas Kiteitzei. And then he has another point. Va'od, sha'amar vayeda onan kilo lo yehazera. He says, look at the language of the psukim. The Torah says that the onan knew that, if he went along with this idea, the child would not be his.
But more than a name.
So it sounds like it's more than a name. So listen to the Ramban. Umara hara'ah shar tavo alav. And Vayera, that he was upset about that. So umara hara'ah shar tavo alav. Ad ki hishchiz zaro mipaneha. Imikare shem beno kashem achiv ames. If it's just a name, says the Ramban, like, what's the big deal? Why was he so upset? Moreover, I'm sorry, Virov b'nei adam misavim la'asos kein. Most people would be, consider it an honor or a pleasure to name after a deceased, a close relative, right? We do it all the time. Not only that, v'lo amar kasu vayomer onen. It's not like, he said, onen said, I don't want to do this. It's going to, make me very unhappy. It says vayeda, aval amar vayeda onen. He knew. What did he know? Right? Ki lo yazara. Ki yadia brura haisalo. He had a clear knowledge. Shelo lo hazara. What does that mean? So here's where the Ramban comes up with his very decisive perspective, and this is very important. Aval ha'inyan sod gadol misodos haTorah, betoldos ha'adam. The Ramban's, as I've said in the past, the Ramban, it was a Makubal. He was a Jewish mystic of the medieval variety. And we know this from historically, and we know it, from his Perush al Torah, where he often, provides Kabbalistic interpretations. He always introduces them by saying al derech ha'emes, which is interesting. Remember, he said ein ze emes before.
And Rosh used the same terminology, no?
Who?
Rosh used the same terminology, al derech ha'emes, no?
No.
Rosh or the Rashba, one of the two.
I'm not sure if the Rashba uses that either, but definitely not the Rosh. But anyways, mostly when the Ramban provides a Kabbalistic
with the some sofa, I think, use it.
Well, that's much later. That's
sorry.
Could be because the Ramban, use it.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah.
Anyway, but let's say it this way: typically, when the Ramban goes mystical, which he does many times in his Perush al Torah, he tells you it's al derech ha'emes, and it's usually after providing like a more traditional, interpretation, a logical one, a Chazal one, etc. This is one of the rare cases, one of the only cases, and in some respect, I think it is the only case in some aspect, where the Ramban's primary pshat is the Kabbalistic pshat. And what he's talking about here is what a notion, that we've heard of and we're familiar with, called Gilgul Neshama. We don't exactly know what it means. Somehow the spiritual continuity, of the mace, right? The mace's neshama through another body. Don't ask me to explain, the details, because, either I'm not capable of it, or if I am, I shouldn't be revealing it anyway, right? So I'll leave you to, speculate on that. But I'm joking. But Indian sod gadol misodos haTorah. This is what the Ramban's talking about. Betoldos ha'adam. The nikar hu le'enei roim asher nosan lahem Hashem einayim liros v'aznayim lishmoa. It's very. The Ramban is speaking in a very, what shall I say, subtle way. Those in the know, those who are insiders, those who have esoteric knowledge, and have insight, an acute sensitivity. He says they know what I mean about the Sod Gadol Misodos HaTorah B'Toldos Adam. This isn't new knowledge. This is ancient knowledge. That when a brother marries a sister-in-law, produce a child, there is great spiritual benefit for the mace. V'hu hara'ui lios kodem bo. That's why the brother should be prior, meaning in this case, it's yibum of a father, as we'll see in a moment. This doesn't exist post Matan Torah, only pre-Matan Torah. But even pre-Matan Torah, the preference of Yehuda was that it should be a brother, because a brother is the perfect host, if you will, for the spiritual continuity of the neshama of the mace. V'achrav hakarov b'mishpacha. This benefit of spiritual continuity is something provided by the closer the family member, the greater or the greater opportunity for accomplishing this esoteric legacy. So that is the, that's what's going on.
Wouldn't the father come before the brother?
What's that?
Yerusha, wouldn't the father come before the brother?
Yes, but that's because.
So in Yibum, then therefore the father should come pre-Matan Torah before the brother, no?
Well, right, but it's not the same fact. I mean, first in Yerusha, it might be per se, but the reason there's a view that brothers only inherit as the sons of their father. They inherit through their father. But I think it's a great point that you're bringing up, but it's not a question. It's more, I think, an insight, and that is that, and I think this, we'd agree about this. Well, you'll tell me if not, but closeness, kurva, isn't always linear, and it's not always one dimensional. The idea that in Yerusha you might be closer to your father because even each child basically is Yoresh by accessing the previous generation. So a brother is the son of your father, so your father comes first. But when it comes to like finding a host, if you will, for the continuity of your neshama, maybe the contemporaneous element, and the fact that, especially if you share, DNA of a father and a mother, there's a case to be
I'm just thinking that, the Rebbeinu Shalom is directing this little scenario, and the Malchus David comes from this, and that pre-Matan Torah, what Yehuda and Tamar did was actually the ultimate, could be looked at as the ultimate Yibum.
Yeah, but I hear you might think that, somebody might say that. That's not what the Ramban is saying.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying that it, because this definitely was orchestrated. Everything's orchestrated above, but
right.
This clearly was orchestrated.
But it can be orchestrated, and it can still be legally second best, but still preferable because of the Rebbeinu Shalom's decision that this is the better outcome. What you were asking me before is maybe legally a father is a closer relative, but remember, we're just not,
not genetically.
Closeness.
Genetically, a brother would be more genetically similar to his brother, presuming that they had the same mother.
Yeah, that's what I said before. Right, 100%. And also they're contemporaries. And also if we're talking about, continuity and security for the wife, it being more contemporaneous is also better. So on many levels, the brother.
But the question begs itself, if they don't give the name of the brother, how does he come Shem b'Yisrael? In what way does he come et Hashem b'Yisrael?
So the Gemara in Yevamos on Chavdala that we read last week says that actually it's that the words, also refer to Yerusha, to inheritance. But I think the other idea is, it's still a legacy, even if you don't name the name. right? And this is especially true for the Ramban. I mean, for Ramban, this is a spiritual, legacy for the mace. So you don't call him Bob.
So if the brother was a Bachorni, it had 2/3 of the Yerusha, would now the 2/3 of the Yerusha...
Well, he never gets 2/3. I mean, okay, whatever. Yeah, the double portion, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, well, the Yavam inherits the brother's portion in the father's estate.
If he's a Bachor, he gets 2/3, right? Or
he's a Bachor, he would get his double portion.
Gets a double portion. Would then the brother that Kayemet Yevamos, would he get that double portion now?
Yeah. Meaning he would, whatever his brother, meaning the Yavam who marries his deceased brother's wife, he will take the full measure of the deceased brother's part in the father's estate. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, let's continue with Ramban for just a minute. So then the Ramban says, "Vayanoagim lisa eshes hanes ha'ach o ha'av o ha'karav min ha'mishpacha." So the tradition was, in this kind of circumstance where there were no children, that a brother, a father, some other relative would step in. He says, I don't know, the Ramban says, if this was like, an old tradition even before Yehuda, or this is the first case. In Bereishis Rabbah, they say that Yehuda was the first. Ki kasher kibela sod me'avosav, this, was an old Kabbalah, an old tradition. Nizdarez lahakimoso. Yehuda was very zariz, he was very eager to fulfill it. Of course, my view is that this is also a way for him, right, to, reestablish his credentials, in the area of brotherhood. The kasher basa Torah, the asra eshes k'tas hakrovim, post Matan Torah, it can't be a father or another karov. It can only be a brother. Sorry. Below Ratza Sheidache Mipanav Isra Eshesach Isra Eshes Ache Ha'av Haben Lezulasam. Ki ba'ach hurgal adavar v'toelas krova v'lo bahem k'moshes karti. Because the greater benefit, and therefore post Matan Torah, the only yibum is with a brother, no longer, even as a secondary option, a father or some other relative. But then he adds, and this is the Ramban L'Shitaso, because if you really think that Yibum in some way is about preserving the spiritual legacy of the mace, so if you want to do Chalitza, it's like you're turning your back on that, right? So that's why the Ramban says, a brother who doesn't want to do Yibum, it's considered achzorius. Achzar is a language of viciousness, cruelty. It's considered cruel if you don't want to be miyabim. Why is it?
Yet it's not compared to what Onan did.
No. But it's well, where's the cruelty? The answer is because you are cutting him off. The continuity. Yeah. The korimoso base chalutzanal ki atach chalatz mehem. It's like right now you are extricating yourself from you're cutting him off. V'ra'uyu she'te'aseh mitzvah zos b'chalitzas hanal. The chachmei Yisrael hakadmonim midaitam ha'inyan nechbad hazeh. The chachmei Yisrael, were aware of all this. Hinhigu lefanim b'Yisrael, and therefore in the olden days they, practiced this idea. Lafsos ha'mais hazeh b'kol yorshei hanakla ba'osam shelo bahem isur she'er. Meaning the Yid of Yibum is only with a brother after Matan Torah, but the idea of Geula, which is what we find in Rus, that would apply to any other relative as long as there's no prohibition that governs their relationship. And that's what he says, V'karu oso Geula, v'zeh inyan Boaz, v'tam nami, ba'ashkenos, ba'maskel yavin. Meaning that's not Yibum, it's Geula, but Geula is like a moderate form or a less acute form of Yibum. That's the Ramban's view. So now you can also understand the next Ramban. The Ramban's a very, very consistent thinker.
So Ramban's position makes the Abba Shaul position, it's difficult to reconcile the two. Because if it's such a strong,
unless you say, but that there still needs to be,
even if it's low lishma, it should still be worth doing.
Unless the purity of motive is part of what makes that, work, right? I don't know how these things work, so I think you'd have to say something like that. Meaning you have the potential to do this, but like you said, it's all fraught. It's like you're on the precipice.
Tightrope.
It's a tightrope. So, to maintain, that fine line, maybe you need lishma. I certainly think that makes sense. Anyway, so look at in the next pasuk, when the Ramban continues his analysis, he's troubled. What is it meaning? Yehuda said to Tamar after the death of Onan, the second son, he said, Shvi almana beis avich. Go to your father's home, remain an almana, right? So, of course, if she's, not going to marry anyone else and she's in a state of zika, then she's going to remain an almana. But the Ramban understood that it meant more than that. So this is very interesting. He says, Shetinahagi almanuseich sham ad yigdal shela. Ramazla, his abli, right? And Tilbashi, big day Avel, the al tasuchi shemen ki isha chagura sak al bal neureha ad sheyigdal shela v'yabem osach ki chen min hagos ken amigog b'misyabemes ki hayotzes v'chapetza linase l'izar loveshes big day Avel yamim ma'at kefi aminag umitnachemes v'loveshes shanim, right? V'techas ifatitalaf.
Do we know how old Shayla was?
What?
We know how old Shayla was?
Yeah, I think we do. I'm trying to remember what they mentioned it in the.
Ad Yigdal normally means until he's bar mitzvah. No, when you say Yigdal.
Yeah, so the Ramban discusses how old he was. Was it 5? Was 3? Was there are different views, but they discuss it. But what's going on here is fascinating. What is the Ramban saying? The Ramban saying he didn't just say to her, wait it out. He said, wait it out and dress and act, nihuge avelus, like an almana, as if to say, the zika, right, is a real, meaning the book is still open on the avel of the son. So let me tell you one other thing. I'm not going to read it inside because it'll take a little too much time, but Rabbeinu Bechai, who was a Talmud of the Ramban, so he says his pshat in Chalutz Hanal. Why in Chalitza? What does it have to do with the shoe? So he says, based on the Ramban, but he goes a little further than the Ramban. He says, listen, in a certain sense, if the brother refuses to do Yibum, and he'll only do Chalitza, so when he does Chalitza, he's kind of like, cementing, he's cutting off the continuity, the spiritual continuity of his brother. So in some sense, he's triggering a second Avel, a second Avelos. The brother died, but on some level, he still has spiritual continuity if you do Yibum. But the second you do Chalitza, and therefore you preclude Yibum, it's almost like a second Avelos. So he says, what does an Avel do? One of the things an Avel does is an Ilas Hasandal, takes off his shoes. So the Rabbeinu Bechai said, so it's so interesting because the Ramban is saying, while she's in Zika, it's like an extended Avelos.
In American phraseology, we would say that because he refused to step into the shoes of his brother, so he's take off the shoe.
That's true also. But the Ramban has it a little bit different. The Ramban says take off a shoe is symbolic of, like, he is throwing away like the opportunity, of fulfilling his brotherly duty. But for Ben Bechai, it's like an Avel, it's like a second Avelos. Like the Avelos when he died, and then there's the Avelos, when, you've cut off the
Was it
opportunity.
also done because of the zikuk, she couldn't marry anybody else? So the idea was that everybody should know that she's off limits to anybody else. So
yeah, but that's not what he's saying. It could be that, or you could just say she's an almana and she's still not married. She can't marry.
By dressing that way, she would be sending a signal to everybody.
Oh, that's for sure also true. But what's Kiddush in the Ramban is that he calls it nihuge avelis. That would be like, simone almanos. This is nihuge avelis as well. Okay, so now the next one. The next one, he speaks about Shayla and what you asked before, like, was he serious or was he, just delaying her? I'm not going to go into that because that, doesn't add legal information. But what I do want to discuss is the next one. We'll stop in a few more minutes. But Yomer Yehuda Hotzi of the Tisarei, Pasuk Chav Dalet. I'm just trying to give you the full picture of the Ramban because it's such an important, perspective in Yibum. So the Ramban says, when Yehuda thought,
he wasn't chayav streifa, basically.
When Yehuda thought that Tamar had violated the Zika, right? And, he said, Hotzi'u of Tisarei, she should be, burned. So the question is, why burned? So Rashi quotes, Omer Ephraim Maksha'a Talmida Shel Rabbi Meir, Mishum Rabbi Meir, Tamar Bito Shel Shem Haisa. So there's a tradition that she was the daughter of Shem. And he was a Kohen, Haisa Shehu Kohen, Lefikach Dano B'Sreifa. That's the Medrash Rabbah. That costs of Rashi. So the Ramban says, Velo Pirsha. Like, he didn't explain it, meaning there's a problem. And then he explains what's the problem. Ani lo yadati adin hazeh. Shebas Kohen ein chayav Sreifa ela biznus im zikas habal aruso nesua. K'moshe mefurish b'gemara b'Sanhedrin. Aval bas Kohen shomeres yavam shezinsa eina b'misa klal. Ubein bas Yisrael bein bas Kohen eina ela b'lav greda.
Only a love.
The Ramban says, listen, she wasn't an Eishes Ish because her husband died. She was in a state of Zika, right? And the Torah says, Losia, Eishes Hames, Hachutza le'ish zar, right? But that's only a lav. It's not Sreifa. So where does she come to Sreifa? So this is very interesting. So then the Ramban says something quite amazing. He says, V'im Tomar, Shahai Yibum Noeg b'bnei Noach, V'hilahem b'chlal eishasish, V'azar shalahem zui misasam. The Ramban says, maybe what you could say is that we have a rule, any of the mitzvahs b'nei Noach they don't have very many mitzvahs, but the mitzvahs they have are subject to the death penalty.
Which mitzvah b'nei Noach did she violate?
So he says maybe there's a tradition or something that Yibum was a mitzvah of Bnei Noach.
You know what the 7 mitzvahs?
Wait. And then it would be Azarasam Zui Misasam. But then he says, he's not saying explicitly your question. He's no V'im Tomar, but then he says, what would it be? So that's why he slips in the words, V'hi lahem b'klal eishes ish. Meaning, maybe the idea is that for Ben Noach, Yibum really is Eishes Hames. It's not Zika. Until you do something, it's Eishes Hames. So maybe it's a violation of Eishes Ish. For Yisrael, we have these, all sorts of nuances. Right? We have Erusin, we have Nesuin, and then we have, Zika, and Yibum, and Chalitza. Maybe the idea is that for Ben Noach, all you have is like, the bigger picture. She's still tied. She's still considered Eishes Hames, but not as a Zika, right? But as an Eishes Ish. So I thought this is very interesting. And let me just add,
wasn't the original more well known response was that a Bas Kohen, that Mizana does get Sreifa?
What do you mean?
I mean, since Shem was a Kohen.
That's what Rashi was saying.
Yeah, so what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that interpretation?
He's just saying, but that's true only for an Eishes Ish. It's not true for a Zika. Let's say you have a Yavama who is a Bas Kohen. Right. I mean, in Jewish law, she doesn't get only a violation of HSA. So I think the idea is as follows: for Jewish law, all these niceties, exist. Meaning, we're much more demanding, but because we're more demanding, we have like more categories, and there are also, a hierarchy of different kinds of violations. So just like we have, our ishus isn't just through chuppah, it's through erison and nesuin, and something we discussed a lot last year. Our divorce is not just, when people decide the marriage is over, right? There's a very specific way to divorce, because you have to, you have to be matir, the ishus and the eshes ish. So yibum, and this goes to what we started the shir with, in my opinion, yibum is like the most acute expression of kedushas ishus, if it's the way that we've been explaining it, in the sense that it demonstrates that marriage is not just a bilateral, bond between husband and wife, but as we noted, I mentioned Rav Hirsch's very, I think, fascinating insight. The name for a bride and a groom is a kala and a chassan, which is a daughter-in-law and a son-in-law. So it's all about the joining of families, and it's all about broader family responsibility. And that's why Yibum is ki yeshvu achim yachtav. So all of that is part of the infrastructure of Jewish values and Jewish, which, by the way, is one of the reasons, that we hopefully have such a strong bond. All Jews are brothers, right? Kol Yisrael Arevim Zel Hazeh. And when we speak about, many obligations between us as, as a brotherly obligation, even if it's not actual, brothers on a DNA level, all of this has to do with this broader, perspective of family and responsibility for family. And, as I say, achenu b'nei, we speak about ourselves as achenu b'nei Yisrael, right? When we speak about a time of crisis, achenu b'nei Yisrael, hanesunim, batzara, and so on. So for us, the idea of a yibum, which isn't an ishus, but is a zika, and therefore is only b'chai b'lavin, makes a lot of sense. But for b'nei Noach, it's either going to be eshes ish or nothing, because the whole idea of this broader family, this wider, brotherly responsibility is not something that we find for Ben Noach, and it's not consistent with the package of Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, which, is at the core of Noahide law. So I think what the Ramban says is, both on a technical level, because of the question that you asked, which is, you can't just say Azaraso Zumi Saso and it's a din of where are you going to get it from? The answer is it can only fit into Eshesish, which they do have. But I think it also is very understandable, and that is either it's Eshesish or it's nothing. You can't have the equivalent of Kiyeshvu Achim Yachdav in a non-Jewish world, which doesn't also have the rest of the infrastructural framework, that the Yibum is built onto, in terms of Kiyeshu Achim Yachtav and so on and so forth. So therefore, the Ramban says
it does have to a degree, because the Sheva Mitzvot B'nei Noach has Goluy Arayot and has,
right, but in a very minimal way.
Dinim, has dinim, which are the courts. So it has two aspects.
No, but what I'm trying to explain to you is that the Gilui Arayos is very limited, and we'll discuss this more next week. For example, there's no Gilui Arayos from the father's side, and according to the Ramban, there's no Gilui Arayos through marriage for Ben Noach, only for a Jew. In other words, let's say Achos Ishto, is one of the Arayos for a Jew, meaning your wife's sister is an erva. But according to the Ramban, and a kaloso, your daughter-in-law, is an erva, meaning even if a man's son and daughter-in-law got divorced, she is still an erva to him forever, as is his, the question of the divorce, but Misa. But all things being equal, Achos Ishto is also an erva. According to the Ramban, these arayos do not apply to a ben Noach, because there's a qualitative difference. There is erva, but it's not. It's much more limited, and it's emo and bito. It's not the broader family connections. That's number one. With regard to dinim, that's a trickier question, but I don't want to get into that right now. But just very briefly, that's a debate between the Rambam and the Ramban. The Rambam's view in Hilchos Malachim is that dinim of a ben Noach only mean to implement the other six, meaning the obligation of dinim is not to have a legal system, it's to enforce the other six. The Ramban thinks that it's to have a legal system. That's true. But even then, there are differences between them. Anyways, that's the view of the Ramban. So in light of all this, it's interesting to note, with this we're going to conclude for today. The Lo Yosif Od L'Dato, if you continue on page 5, the Ramban understands that once Yehuda was aware of the reality, and that that he had inadvertently engaged in an act of yibum with his daughter-in-law Tamar, it says V'lo Yasaf Od L'Data. Acharei Ramban says Acharei Kim Zera Lebanav Lo Ratza Liosima Od Apapisha Yabir Tzono Ki Einena Asura Alav B'Haisa Ishto Kim Bishpata Yivamim. The Ramban is taking the interpretation Lo Yasaf means he didn't continue the relationship. He terminated the relationship, but he's telling you, even though there was nothing wrong with the relationship. The Zetama Omer Kilo Pasak, meaning because there was nothing wrong with the relationship, that's the reason that the other interpreter says Lo Yasaf means he didn't end it, right? Ksiv Hakav Lo Yasaf, Ksiv Hasam Kol Gadol Lo Yasaf. He says, but in his opinion, he did terminate, even though there was nothing wrong with it. So that's very puzzling. Like, what does that mean? So I want to pick up with that next time. The Ramban, in his, what I'm going to discuss next time, is the Ramban in his commentary to Masachet Yevamos, which you can look at just for a minute. And I'm going to get back to this point. This is on page 6. Chidush Ramban Masachet Yevamot, Tzadi Ches Amud Aleph. It's here where the Ramban makes the point that my response to Dr. Weg a minute ago, which was, according to the Ramban, there's no erva for ben Noach based on marital relationship, meaning a daughter-in-law, a sister-in-law, meaning the sister of one's wife. According to the Ramban, these are erva for Yisrael, but not for ben Noach. So if you look at the Ramban, he says that B'hu Adin Nami, this is Kiddush Ramban Yivamos Tzadi Ches Amud Aleph, page 6 in the Marmakomos. Ramban says, B'hu Adin Nami Barayos the Ishus Kagon Eishes Kroven de Bataris Begiyuson de Gabe Arayos Kicha Ksiv B'hu V'inu Kicha Leis Lahu V'lo Gomrinon Mid'ashkacham Lahu Eishes Av the Chidushu to Afgarin Rachmano is Arayu Kedefrishos. So in these words, the Ramban basically says that the erva of a ben Noach is limited to the mother's family, meaning relatives through the mother, mostly with one exception, not through the father, and not through marriage. So the Ramban brings a raya. He says, how do I know this? Bahare Yaakov nasa shtei achios, because Yaakov Avinu married 2 sisters. Right? We're not up to that yet in the Parshas Shavua, but Rachel and Leah. Vilmale hayu asuros, if they were really off limits, because the ben Noach is not allowed to marry relatives of his wife, like a sister, hayu chachamim tzrichen lefarish shelo hayu achios min ha'em. Then the Chachamim would have had to said something, explained it in some way, for example, to say Maybe they were daughters of the same father, but not of the same mother, which is what counts for Bnei Noach. But no one ever said that because no one's bothered by it. V'lo pirshu came b'shum makom. And not only that, Hare Yehuda, Amar al Tamar, Kaloso, Tzadka, Mimeni. Yehuda said about his daughter-in-law Tamar, she's right. The Elohoisa Asura Mishum Kala, if she was prohibited as his daughter-in-law, Akate Chayevas even Misa Darayos. It wouldn't have been, she would have been liable. Because how could she have a relationship with her father-in-law? It says he didn't continue with her. Right? He says, no. Here he says what he doesn't say in the Ramban Torah. Says the reason he didn't continue his relationship with her is not because they did anything wrong, but because he still felt that the better candidate for Yibum would have been Sheila, would have been the brother.
But we have halacha that even if the better candidate is there, if somebody jumps ahead, another brother.
That's within brothers.
Yeah.
So, and even here, he's not saying it was us, or he's not saying he wasn't comfortable. But still, you can see there's a difference between an older brother, younger brother, and a brother and a father, even Kodem Matan Torah. So that's the Ramban. But the Rashba, what does I leave you to think for next time? Look at the Rashba for a minute. In the next piece, the Rashba says, you can't bring a raya from Tamar and Yehuda. It says, Miu ain't Tamar raya. Tu muteras haisaloli Yehuda, Dvar Torah mishum Yavama. The Kodem Matan Torah yibum muter bekrovav. Ela sherotza Yehuda lina kederach shetziv satorah be'achim lo ba'av sha'ach ikar. The Rashba says against the Ramban, how could you prove from the fact that Yehuda had a relationship with his daughter-in-law that there is no Ben Noach prohibition? Maybe there was a prohibition, but maybe just like Eishes Ach is permitted, the Makom Yibum, for the mitzvah of Yibum, so Kalaso is permitted, the Makom Yibum. That's not a good proof. This is a case of mitzvahs Yibum. So I want to address that question next week. And then I want to talk about the Sfarno's understanding of the Psukim. And then we'll talk about a little more about whether the mitzvah of Yibum applies only to the man or to the woman. What about the mitzvah of Chalitza? What about the connection to Pirya Varivya? A little bit more preliminary things, and then we'll start going straight through the Gemaras. Okay? So that is the plan going forward for the next few weeks. But next week we'll finish up with this and with the Rashba and the Ramban.
Good night.
Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you.
Laila Tov, thank you. Toda Rabba.
Night. Thank you, Rabbi.